All right. So, this article asks, like, what will gay culture even look like in 20 years?
Yeah.
And I gotta say, it's a tough one.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 2035 isn't that far off, and like things are changing so fast in the LGBTQ plus world.
Absolutely.
So what do you think? Like, is this 2015 New Republic piece?
Hmm.
Do its predictions hold any water?
I think it's a fascinating time capsule.
Yeah,
2015 was just after the legalization of same-sex marriage here in the U.S.
right.
Huge win, obviously.
Of course.
But it also kind of threw open this Pandora's box of like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so now what?
Exactly.
What-
Like, is it all just smooth sailing towards happily ever after? Or,
Right.
does something vital get lost when LGBTQ plus folks become more mainstream?
Yeah.
You know,
That tension really jumps out from the article.
Oh, totally.
Some contributors are super stoked about integration,
Oh, right.
while others are like, whoa, hold on. Are we losing that countercultural edge? That
Exactly.
unique thing that defined us?
Okay, so to understand those anxieties,
Yeah.
I think we need to like unpack what assimilation versus radicalism actually means
Right.
in this context.
For sure. So assimilation is about being absorbed into the dominant culture,
Okay.
maybe at the cost of some distinct traditions or values,
I see.
Radicalism, on the other hand, is pushing for more fundamental changes to the system itself,
Gotcha.
not just inclusion within it.
So not just like a seat at the table, but like
Exactly.
changing the whole,
Remaking the tip.
remaking the whole darn table. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that in mind, we see folks like Kara Balonik,
Yes.
who's happily married to a woman but still cringes at the word wife
Interesting.
or being affectionate in public.
Wow.
It's like, even with legal equality,
Yeah.
the ghosts of past shame still linger,
Absolutely. And I think that internalized homophobia,
Yeah,
it's a powerful reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
definitely not.
Balonic's experience speaks to a broader concern voiced by several contributors,
Okay.
the rise of what they call homonormativity.
Okay, homonormativity. Break
Yeah.
that down for me.
Sure.
What's exactly are that?
So essentially, it's the idea that certain LGBTQ plus identities and lifestyles
Hmm.
become the acceptable face of the community,
Oh, interesting.
often mirroring white middle-class norms.
Okay.
Think picket fences, marriage, 2.5 kids, the whole 9 yards.
Gotcha.
The worry is that this reinforces the marginalization of those who don't fit that mold,
Right.
like trans folks, people of color, those who are non-monogamous, and so on.
So instead of challenging the system,
Yeah,
it's more like conforming to it.
right. And contributor Linda Villarosa really hits on this,
Okay.
fearing we'll lose those vibrant subcultures, the art, the activism
Yeah.
that thrived when LGBTQ plus folks were on outside looking in.
Right. It's like once the fight for basic rights is won, does that fire go out?
It's a valid question. Does a community need a common enemy to stay cohesive?
It's deep.
Villarosa's concern is that mainstream acceptance
Yeah.
might ironically lead to a loss of identity, even as it brings greater visibility and rights.
So it's almost like, will the future be all rainbow branded everything,
Like-
corporate sponsored pride parades,
Exactly.
while the truly radical subversive spirit gets paved over?
Right.
I mean, visibility is great,
Sure.
but is there a risk of losing something more authentic along the way?
That's the tension
Yeah.
many of the contributors are wrestling with.
Yeah.
And it's not just about aesthetics either.
Right.
There's a real concern that as LGBTQ plus folks become more palatable to the mainstream, the focus will shift away from the most vulnerable members of the community,
That's a good point. Yeah, for sure.
the ones who still face the most discrimination.
Speaking of shifting focus,
Yeah.
writer William Johnson brought up something that really got me thinking.
Okay.
The rise of online echo chambers
Yeah.
and how they might be impacting the LGBTQ plus community. He painted this vivid picture of a pre-internet gay club in the Bronx called The Warehouse.
The Warehouse.
And it was this incredible melting pot
Wow.
where you could have like a thugged out neighborhood boy
Okay.
hanging out with like a discourse-ready academic,
Wow.
finding common ground through their shared queerness.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it was just like this amazing coming together.
It's a powerful example of how physical spaces can force interaction and exposure to diverse viewpoints
Right.
in a way that online spaces often don't.
It's true.
Online, it's easy to curate our own little bubbles where everyone agrees with us.
Oh, totally.
And that can lead to fragmentation within the larger LGBTQ plus community.
So are you saying that the internet is inherently BAD for building community?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
It's more about how we're using it.
Okay.
Because, let's be real, online spaces have been huge E for LGBTQ plus folks.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially those in rural areas or places where they're not accepted.
Yeah, where they might not have any other
Exactly.
options to connect.
Right. So it's definitely not black and white.
Okay.
Online platforms can be incredible tools for connection,
Right.
especially for those who lack physical communities.
I see.
But there's also a real risk of echo chambers and filter bubbles,
Sure.
where we're only exposed to information that reinforces our existing beliefs
Right.
and that can hinder our understanding of the diverse experiences within the LGBTQ plus community
Totally.
and make it harder to build solidarity and work towards common goals.
So in a way, both homonormativity and the internet present this double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Potential for greater acceptance and visibility,
Right.
but also a risk of losing that radical edge, that sense of shared struggle that often defines a community.
Definitely.
And as we go deeper into this article, it seems like that tension is only going to get more intense.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
It's going to be fascinating to see how it all plays out. You know what strikes me about this article is how it doesn't shy away from like the internal debates
Oh, yeah.
within the LGBTQ plus community.
Totally.
It would have been easy to just paint this rosy picture of like unity and progress.
Right.
But this deep dive
Yeah.
really digs into those anxieties and disagreements about what queer futures should actually look like.
Yeah, it's refreshing to see that honesty.
Right.
Like, not everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
And that's okay.
Yeah,
But it makes predicting the future
Yeah.
even more complicated.
for sure.
One prediction that really stuck with me was Ira Silverberg's idea
Okay.
that by 2035,
Hmm.
the focus will shift towards historical preservation.
Interesting.
Almost like we'll need museums to remind people of the
Yeah.
struggles and sacrifices that led to LGBTQ plus acceptance.
It's almost ironic, isn't it?
Right.
Achieving equality, but then having to fight to remember the inequality that came before.
Totally.
I think it speaks to a fear that future generations
Yeah.
growing up in a more accepting world
Mm-hmm.
might take those hard-won rights for granted.
And it makes me think about those we lost along the way,
Yeah.
especially during the AIDS epidemic.
Cool.
Will future generations even grasp the magnitude of that loss?
It's hard to say.
You know, will they understand what it meant to fight for your life,
Right.
for your community, in a time when so much was at stake?
That's a sobering thought.
Yeah,
And it highlights the importance of not just achieving legal equality,
right.
but also ensuring that the history and diversity of LGBTQ plus experiences are passed down.
We need those stories, those voices to keep that memory alive.
Absolutely.
Now, another contributor who offered a pretty provocative take was Alok Vaidmanin,
Okay.
a trans activist and artist.
Mm-hmm.
They argued that the term queer itself has become gentrified,
Mm-hmm.
losing its radical political edge and turning into a sort of
Right.
depoliticized aesthetic.
So Vaidmanin's point is that queer is becoming trendy, almost commodified.
Right.
We see it slapped on everything from clothing to coffee mugs.
Yeah.
Which raises the question, does that widespread visibility translate into meaningful social change?
Right.
Or does it, as Vaidmanin fears, actually hinder it
Yeah.
by making it seem like the work is done?
It's like, are we becoming more acceptable to the mainstream,
Mm-hmm.
but less willing to challenge the status quo?
Yeah,
And it makes me wonder, what does it even mean to be queer?
right.
In a world where LGBTQ plus identities are becoming increasingly normalized.
That's the crux of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
As those old markers of queerness,
Mhm.
oppression, marginalization, fighting for basic rights,
Right.
start to shift what takes their place.
What values and ideals will define queerness in the future?
That's the question.
And will those values be shared across the entire LGBTQ plus community?
Good point.
Because another theme that came up in the article was this worry about fragmentation,
Yeah.
which takes us back to William Johnson's point about the warehouse and online echo chamber.
Right. Johnson's contrast between that pre-internet melting pot
Mm-hmm.
and the potential for online spaces to divide us.
Yeah.
It's really striking.
It is.
Instead of rubbing shoulders with people from all walks of life,
Right.
we can easily curate our own little online worlds where everyone agrees with us.
Right. It's like choosing your own adventure.
Exactly.
But everyone's picking the same path.
Yeah.
So do you think online spaces are inherently incapable of fostering that kind of diverse interaction
Mhm.
that Johnson described?
It's not about demonizing the internet.
Okay.
Online platforms can be powerful tools for connection,
Right.
especially for folks who are geographically isolated or lack access to physical communities.
For sure.
But we need to be mindful of those echo chamber effects
Okay.
and actively seek out diverse perspectives.
So it's more about being intentional about the online spaces we engage with
Yeah.
and making an effort to connect with people outside of our usual bubbles.
Exactly.
But even if we do that,
Mm-hmm.
there's still the issue of different levels of privilege and marginalization
Absolutely.
within the LGBTQ plus community itself, right?
Right. And that's where Meredith Luson's call for greater intersectionality becomes so important.
Okay.
She argues that the future of the LGBTQ plus movement
Mm-hmm.
hinges on prioritizing the needs of its most marginalized members,
Right.
like trans women of color,
Yeah.
who face overlapping forms of discrimination.
Like liberation for some
Right.
can't come at the expense of continued oppression for others.
Exactly.
We need to move forward together,
Yes.
recognizing that our struggles are interconnected.
And this ties back to what Wo Chan said.
Oh, yeah.
No single-issue poems,
Mhm.
because we don't live single-issue lives.
Powerful stuff.
It is.
You can't separate LGBTQ plus rights from issues like economic inequality,
Right.
racial justice, or climate change,
Yeah.
all of which disproportionately impact queer communities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
So it seems like the future of gay culture is anything but predictable.
For sure.
It's going to be shaped by these larger forces of technology, social change, and this ongoing fight for a more just world.
Absolutely.
But what stood out to me from this section of the article is that question of what it means to be queer
Right.
when those old definitions start to break down.
And as we move into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll explore some potential scenarios for what that future might hold
Sounds good.
and how we might grapple with that evolving definition of queerness.
Okay, so we've covered like a ton of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the joys and anxieties of marriage equality
Right.
to the potential pitfalls of like homonormativity. And I think if there's one thing that's clear,
Yeah.
it's that predicting the future of gay culture
Oh, yeah.
is no easy feat.
Definitely not. It's constantly evolving, just like the LGBTQ plus community itself.
Right.
But even with all this uncertainty,
Mhm.
I think this deep dive has helped us pinpoint some key tensions
Okay.
that will likely shape the years ahead.
Totally.
Hmm.
And for me, the biggest takeaway is that ongoing like tug of war
Yeah,
between assimilation and radicalism.
absolutely.
How do we balance the desire to be accepted by the mainstream
Right.
with the need to protect those unique, sometimes subversive
Yeah.
elements of LGBTQ plus history and culture?
It's a tough one.
It's a real head scratcher.
It is. And it makes me think about Linda Villarosa's point
Okay.
about the potential loss of that vibrant art and activism
Right.
that thrived when LGBTQ plus folks were fighting for basic rights.
Right.
Will those creative forces still flourish once those battles are won?
Yeah.
Or will mainstream acceptance lead to a kind of creative complacency?
It's almost like we need to find new ways to be queer.
Yeah.
In a world where being queer isn't necessarily about being on the outside anymore.
Right.
What does that even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it circles back to Alok Vaidmanan's critique of queer becoming a depoliticized aesthetic.
Right.
Will it become just another marketing category, stripped of its power to challenge norms and disrupt the status quo?
Now, that's a scary thought.
It is a bit.
But then again, haven't there always been tensions
Oh, yeah.
between more radical and assimilationist approaches
For sure.
within the LGBTQ plus movement?
Absolutely.
Could this just be an evolution of that dynamic
Right.
playing out in a new context?
I think you've hit on a key point there.
Yeah.
These tensions aren't new.
Okay.
What's changing is the landscape in which they're playing out.
Right.
As LGBTQ plus folks gain greater acceptance and visibility,
Mm-hmm.
the very definition of queer becomes more fluid,
Yeah.
more contested.
So maybe the question isn't so much about preserving some fixed notion of gay culture,
Right.
but rather about how we navigate those ongoing tensions, those different visions for the future,
Yeah.
in a way that honors our history,
Absolutely.
while also creating space for new possibilities.
Exactly. And technology is going to play a huge role in how those tensions play out.
Oh, for sure.
Remember William Johnson's warning about online echo chambers?
Of course.
We need to be mindful of how the internet can both connect and divide us,
Totally.
amplifying certain voices while silencing others.
So the gay internet of the future,
Yeah.
could be a force for good,
It could?
helping LGBTQ plus folks connect across geographical boundaries and build solidarity.
For sure.
But it could also exacerbate those divisions we've been talking about,
Right.
leading to even greater fragmentation within the community.
It's a double-edged sword.
It all depends on how we use it.
Right. And that's where individual choices come in.
Okay.
Are we actively seeking out diverse perspectives online? Are we engaging in respectful dialogue even when we disagree?
Yeah.
Are we using our platforms to amplify the voices of those who are often marginalized?
It sounds like what you're saying is that the future of gay culture isn't some preordained thing.
Not at all.
It's something we're actively creating through our choices, our relationships, our engagement with the world around us.
Precisely. And that brings us back to that question we posed at the beginning of this deep dive. What does it mean to be truly queer?
Right.
In a world where LGBTQ plus identities are becoming more visible,
Yeah.
but potentially less radical.
That's a question I'm going to be pondering for a while.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners will too, because the answer isn't going to come from some expert or article. It's something we each need to figure out for ourselves.
And maybe that's the most exciting part of it all.
Yeah.
The future of gay culture is still being written.
I like that.
And we all have a role to play in shaping what that future will look like.
Well said. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. But as always, thanks for listening.
It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.